Well, Fellows of the Society of Antiquaries and guests, welcome to Cardiff. As the new chair of the Welsh Fellows group of the Antiquaries, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this, which is a meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London, one of their out of London meetings. And they have a Welsh one once every year, loosely arranged around, I mean, it's not loosely arranged, but arranged loosely around St. David's Day, which, you know, is just past. So welcome, and thank you very much for coming out here. Since you came last, a year ago, it's all been happening in Wales, as you know, with the birth of Gwynedd a year ago, elected by Harold Bell, first chairman, a few weeks ago, for the Believer Welsh Archaeology Day, Burlington House last night. Ongoing celebrations of what we're doing this side.
Thank you very much. Start the formal business. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Ordinary meeting Thursday, the 27th of February 2025, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 20th of February 2025 were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Heathfield Down, 1066. Why this could be the actual site of the Battle of Hastings, by Rebecca Welshman and Mr. Simon Coleman. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 6th of March, which will be an out-of-London meeting held in Cardiff, and then adjourn the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Ballots.
So I'm just going to read the names, but of course the further information is available on the
These
on
are the
website.
fellows who were elected in the ballot that closed today.
Edward Archer, Mike Bentley, Katie Carter, Rebecca Foote, Noah Herringman, Matthew Simon Hobson, Sushma Jansari, John Christopher Jenkins, Ollie Jones, Gladys Montail, Jane Elizabeth Rempel, Laura Slack, Daniel Starzer Smith, Malcolm Thick.
We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a paper from our fellow Dr. Mark Redknap. What it doesn't say on here, my briefing, is that Mark and I were undergraduate students together at the Institute of Archaeology in the 1970s and spent a happy summer in 1975 excavating a rural site in Sussex. So it's a particular pleasure for me not only to be with you in Cardiff for our annual lecture, but also to welcome Mark. As you'll be aware, Mark is now an Honorary Research Fellow at the National Museum here, having retired in 2023 as Head of Collections and Research in the Department of History and Archaeology. He began his career having done his undergraduate and PhD at the Institute of Archaeology in London as an Assistant Curator at the Passmore Edwards Museum at Stratford, 1983-1988, moving here to Cardiff in 1988 as initially Curator of Medieval and Later Archaeology. He's done an extraordinarily wide range of field work, as well as his terrestrial work we'll be hearing something of today. He was also a pioneer in underwater archaeology and most recently involved with Alan Aberg and Sian Rees in the Wales and the Sea project, and has worked at Llangorse crannog with Alan Lane. He's also the author of important corpus of late Roman and early medieval Mayen pottery from the Eifel in Germany, and work on early medieval inscribed and sculptured stone, Roman, post-Roman ceramics and metalwork in Wales. Extraordinary wide range through his career. He's going to talk to us this evening about excavations at Llanbedrgoch, if I'm not messing the pronunciation of that too much, the development of an early medieval trading centre in Viking-age Wales. Welcome, Mark.
And it's a delight to be able to talk not just about the Viking period activity that took place on this site, but some of the earlier periods as well. And my apologies if I do skate over prehistory just a little bit within time. Many of you will be familiar with this rather ancient map of that George Boone produced, echoing Mackinder's British Mediterranean. For classicists, of course, there were no similarities, or very few similarities. But from a geographer's point of view, he saw this as a land-girt quadrilateral whose four sides are England, Scotland, and Wales, which says a lot about the highways connecting. And of course, what you do notice is that Anglesey more or less sits in the centre network. And of course, your perspective does slightly change depending on where you're standing. So, but I think what becomes clear, I've just marked out some of the more famous Viking boards, sort of high up view of the Irish Sea. You can see that if you are heading out of Dublin in a ship, or Chester, or coming south from Kintyre, Peel and Mona are within easy access and more or less within a day's sailing of Dublin. More than 30 years have passed since this site's discovery. I hesitate to say that, but it is true. And it started with the discovery of metal-detected artifacts in some of the fields around the medieval, what was a medieval farm known as Glyn, in the parish of Llanbedrgoch. This is one of the early maps we produced, just showing its association with some early Viking Age finds, contemporary with the initial finds that led us to the site, namely the reporting of coins from a Carolingian hoard buried in the mid-9th century, and 3 lead weights from a totally different field, which rang alarm bells in a sense, because merchants' weights are normally associated with graves or trading settlements. And following an initial visit to the site, we were able ultimately to go back for 10 seasons, starting in 1994, with a very small team of about 7 or 8 of us for a week. But we were extremely fortunate during that period in that the geophysics immediately produced rather stunning curvilinear anomaly encircling the fine spot of the lead weights. And we, during that week, were able to trial trench some of these anomalies, obtain charcoal for radiocarbon dating. And we did recover a few artifacts as well. The radiocarbon dates confirmed that we were looking at early medieval sites. And this wasn't initially enough to allow us to embark on a long-term program of research, which incrementally developed as each season produced new results. I'd like to start at the end, because everything is about teamwork. And I'd like to, from the outset, to thank all those who have contributed in the past or are continuing to contribute to this project as it draws to an end. And we've benefited from specialist skills, covering many fields from onomastics to artifact analysis, Bayesian analysis by John Hines here, and a wide range of voluntary work and skilled supervision. And I'd like to thank all the unnamed contributors who are continuing to contribute unseen behind the scenes to bringing this to fruition. And in particular, of course, the landowner Roger and Debbie Tebbert, who allowed us to excavate there in the first place, and thankfully have been welcoming us with open arms ever since. We've decided to name the sites that we investigated using the 17th century field names. And you can see that some of them here on the figure. The Welsh name Glyn gives you an obvious clue that the isolated farm nestles at the end of a tree-lined valley with stepped limestone outcrops defining some of these spaces. Many of the 18th century dwellings in the area were small holdings, and fewer than a dozen exceeded 60 acres. And Glyn was one of 4 exceeding 100 acres. So it was quite a large estate. These are the 2 main access points for any period from the sea. You've got Red Wharf Bay, and we're looking towards the site on the far side of the bay, and Bentlech Sand. And the site is literally a 15-minute walk from both of these access. So here we have the initial magnetometer survey, coupled with some later work, incorporating work by the Gwynedd Archaeological Trust, which we're really grateful for. But it was that initial work by Mike Hamilton that produced Site 2's amazing plot with evidence for at least 2 enclosure ditches. So we started to investigate all of those. The other reason for going, not just the lead weight, was the Carolingian hoard. And top left, you can see 2003, which is marking the position of one of the coins found in that year, literally a few meters from the earlier finds, which began to be reported in the early 90s, pre-Auto Antiquity. But the best way of describing what we found over the years is possibly to take a conventional chronological approach. And so this is a summary of some of the Mesolithic material, our earliest material from the site. The landscape around Glyn has many characteristics whose potential for sustaining life would have been recognized by visitors looking for places to establish their camps and settlements at this period. It's a free-draining limestone, fertile soil, south-facing slopes, and with a plentiful water supply, where the big red dot in the middle is, we have a freshwater spring, which is still in use today. And I'm particularly like to thank Elizabeth Walker for her work on the lithics for the report. The site was attractive and can be compared in terms of peat deposits. We have part of the peat deposits from Park Gubby, where a late glacial lake began to infill from around 1000 BC, indicating a period of open grassland vegetation, birch scrub and woodland expansion. By around 8000 BC, the landscape was mixed woodland, hazel, birch, alder and willow, with trees growing around the edge of the lake through the Mesolithic period. And the key thing about Llanbedrgoch is that we've got some indication of the local environment at the start of the Holocene from the results here. And the flint work includes early Mesolithic material, not a huge, but they include obliquely blunted forms of microlith, generally dated by Elizabeth to around 9400 BC to 8700. To get a rough idea of the dates there. And these are probably hunting losses within a landscape that would have been ideal for small seasonal camp. We've got later Mesolithic material as well, largely recovered from the spring line, where that big red dot is. We've got one of the interesting things about a lot of the lithics, both the Neolithic and Mesolithic stuff, is the high proportion is residual. And it's not simply residual in plough soil, residual within early medieval deposits, which does mean that it can be a little problematic to date features if you only got a few lithics, nothing else, by accident. You could still be dealing with an early medieval feature. This gives you the situation in the Neolithic period with some of the adjacent monuments. And of course, we have Anglesey has plentiful stone tombs from the period, at least 18 recorded burial monuments containing early Neolithic material. And we've got at least 3 or 4 in the area of Llyn, and a few are on this map. And I've also put on there the positions of 2 burnt mounds that we found during the course of excavation. Most of the pits that you see in this unfinished plan, this is an early version, in the bottom left corner are in fact Neolithic features containing either lithics or pottery. I'm glad that Jess is in the audience because he's been working very hard in completing some of this work. And some of the finds from these features are fantastic. So here we've got a complete obsolete bowl from one of the pits. It's probably a simple inverted form, or less likely a steeply incurving rim, but the rim's missing. And the whole surface is decorated, as you can see, with oblique lines of whipped or twisted cord impression. And John Llewellyn-Williams and the late David Jenkins analysed the fabric, and the fabric of this pot belongs to their group 3B, its inclusions. Coupled to the pottery, we do have some radiocarbon dates, which also allows us to contextualize material. So we have, this is the distribution of the Neolithic material by quantity from the site. So we've got axe head fragments, stone tools, pottery, Bronze Age lithics, or transitional late Neolithic Bronze Age materials. A lot of the material in the lower part of the enclosure there, which is the early medieval enclosure, Montu, is in fact in residual. Although there is a paleosoil below early medieval at Midden horizons area. But I think the suggestion is that with the post holes in the upper part of within that early medieval enclosure, and that cluster 664, 639, that we have some sort of occupational activity going on. For the Bronze Age, we have 2 burnt mounds, but interestingly, no metalwork from the site. So clearly there's a hiatus in terms of the areas that we've managed to look at. So site 4 is an early Bronze Age mound. It produced a radiocarbon date of 2137 to 1936, Cal BC. And the trough survived quite well there. And the second mound indicated here, it's been truncated by the early medieval enclosure ditch, which has come from the left corner of the trench, curving round to where the arrow is. And this is, in fact, the bottom southwest corner of the early medieval enclosure, with the remnants of a stone rampart there. But the burnt mound is that lighter area, again, produced an interesting radiocarbon date. Iron Age material is thin on the ground. We do have this unusual crouched burial within an incomplete cyst. And it does form an important addition to the corpus of Crouch Iron Age burials known in Wales, which is quite a small list. The radiocarbon date for this, and I should have put it up on the screen rather than try reading out all these dates for you, is Cal 353 to 285 BC, 229 to 92. And that overlaps with the radiocarbon date for peat formation in Caer Llwyn Crwn, where we had the earlier burnt mound. That's Alice Roberts, is one of the people excavating before she joined television. A number of artifacts belong to that transitional period between the Iron Age and the early Roman period. And we're looking here at a little cluster of objects from the spring line near that burnt mound in the field to the west of the early medieval enclosure. The lower object is a sword belt or harness ring. It belongs to a fairly well-known general type. Evan Chapman is kindly looked at, brought it on, coming from the mid-1st century AD. So immediately you think of Agricola and Petronius Paulinus, what is happening when the Romans arrive. The Roman brooches on this slide generally fit with the types of bow brooches found in the region, not on this slide, but from site 2. But these are interesting examples that have an early date, and they're unusual in being found so far west. They could plausibly derive from the invasion period, but of course we don't know that. In terms of the overall metalwork assemblage for the Roman period, it's comparatively small, but it is significant in terms of rural sites and Anglesey. So when you compare it with some of the better known sites in England, of course, it's a very small image. In terms of what this means, Adam, who's here with us as well, has been looking at, and members of the Port of Antiquity scheme, been looking at 2 assemblages that were found fairly close by, one of late Iron Age or early Roman date, found on the outskirts of Llanbedrgoch, again on a spring line. And the other one is a cluster of objects from the beach at Bentley. They are very interesting in their own right. And it makes you wonder what the wider context of this process of deposition is at this period. One thing we were keen to do was to follow up on all metal detected finds from the area. And so site 1A is a small hill overlooking the Carolingian board find spot. And because of the discovery of Roman coin in the vicinity, we decided to have a look at the top of the hill, and we've identified this little enclosure. Could go back to the Iron Age, we don't know, and 3 putative hut circles. We're looking at a limestone rise at about 89 meters above the stratum. So it's quite a good strategic location, a good field of view to the north and in other directions. The site of the Carolingian hoard produced this geophysics dot, thanks to the Gwynedd Archaeological Trust. And what's interesting here, we were already finding clusters of late Roman coins and ceramics. And you can see that there is at least one roundhouse and one squarish looking building, or possibly another roundhouse, but it's a different shape. It's not quite clear where it looks as if there's possibly an enclosure, but the natural fault lines and the geology make this survey quite hard to read. Turning to site 2, the site that we spent most of our time on, this is the plotted distribution of some of the finds. One of the very interesting objects is a Roman enameled vessel in the very center of the enclosure, 4 fragments. of Roman enamelled vase, very similar to one in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is found in Llangorse in France. This might be simply raw material for metalworking rather than, it certainly looks as if it's something that's been broken up. But the fact that it is there, I think, is quite. And just to show you some nice objects, these are little ox head escutcheons, and of general types that are known from North Wales, although they do differ in form. I mean, everyone can give you the detail. The lower one has a possible parallel in Staffordshire from Fort Constantine. But they are quite interesting as well. And these were found just to the north of Llynfell. So we've been plotting all periods of objects. We've been plotting ironwork as well, because we're picking up metalworking activity that way. We've got no evidence on the site 2, which you see the geophysics plot here for, of buildings during the Roman period. But the pottery sequences and the coins point to concentrated activity within this oval, upper oval, between the 2nd and 4th century. Turning to this transition between the Roman period and the early medieval, one consequence at the moment, we have a problem in a sense, looking at early medieval settlement in Wales, because the database is so small. And I think the rule of thumb has to be absence of evidence, isn't it? Evidence of absence. All cases. So apart from well-known excavations, Llangorse Bank, Dennis Powys, Book, and so on, which have already been published, Boone Campbell has reassessed a lot of the early evidence by more recent work by Andy Seaman there. There are still a number of questions that we have about early medieval settlement. They're normally broken down into elite hill forts, Dennis Powys and Deganwy, enclosed settlements defined by rectilinear boundaries, such as Travel, undefended promontory sites, such as 6th to 7th century Llangorse Bank. And then we have the solitary crannog at Llangorse that I looked at with Alan, a remarkable site, a remarkable survival in Breconshire, and well dated because of the dendrochronology. Some of these sites have been paired with monasteries, so Dennis Powys with Llanbedrgoch, Llangorse Bank with Penally, for example, and Llangorse with the monasterium at Llangorse. So we've got that sort of hierarchy, but a lot of these sites are quite early. A lot of them haven't been intensively investigated. So there remain weaknesses in our understanding of many significant issues, including how particular settlement types fit in within early medieval society, who instigated their construction, who put them up, whether their social settings changed in terms of who used them, how they originally functioned, and what were their life trajectories. All those are relatively unanswered for them. Here we have the radiocarbon dates for the infill of the ditch around the area of late Roman settlement. And it's quite clear that we're looking at a ditch that may conceivably have been added around an enclosure, the existing enclosure. The suggestion is that we're looking at probably a 6th century date for the infilling of the ditch. Now, we don't know how often that was recut, so we can't really say when that ditch was actually cut. But the likelihood is that the oval enclosure had some sort of boundary around it, very similar to its adjacent site at Pantysaer, which is literally a short walk to the north. You can see that it has this rather substantial oval enclosure, stone-footed stone roundhouses, and a couple of later rectangular buildings added on. So Pantysaer is an interesting model. And the assumption is that this is a Romano-British settlement and that the rampart is all one build. I suppose we have to ask whether the rampart might have been, remodeled in the later period. We're looking at the very best earth-fast stone walling here, needs mention, is prone to collapse. We know that some features within the early medieval period, the first phase, phase 8 on the side, show evidence of continuity. So here we have this interesting feature within the enclosure, slabline pit. The primary fill on the slide there gives us a date of 363 to 641 AD. The bottom of it had a sticky, greasy, bluish-grey, cess-like clay fill with some charcoal and bone, but it looked like cess leach from decay above, and it overlay high phosphate staining bedrock. So it looks as if this was a latrine, and sensibly using the plank-like slabs of limestone to line it. But I think what the midfill is interesting because it's slightly different in texture. It becomes more greasy, possibly late latrine use before it was sealed with a higher deposit. And that middle deposit gave us a date of 609, if you this beginning and end date, 609 to 892. So that is being infilled at a much later period. And one has to wonder whether this is cleaned out periodically and it just stays in use for a very long period. Interestingly, Meredith looked at the animal bone. Meredith would, in looking at the animal bone from the site, part of an AHRC-funded CDP, a collaborative doctoral award. And she noticed that the animal bone included domestic species of bird, suggesting a change in the deposition practices in that midfill, along with numerous small identifiable calcine bone fragments, but including cattle, sheep, right, showing what the overall status is of them. But one theory is that the burnt bone might have been part of a sealing deposit following that change of function from latrine to a dedicated waste disposal unit, which was quite handily next to some of the more substantial buildings. And in the, there is one other feature which showed continuity between lower fills and upper fills in the same way. There isn't time to go into the detail. So we're looking at the later fill here, that ditch. One of the things that we've noticed during the excavation is that the building practice changed during the early medieval period. One of the issues was the date of the enlargement of the enclosure from the oval period, oval phase to the later phase. And in the very first interim reports, we said that it had, the rampart had appeared by the mid-9th century. A reasonable statement at the time. But of course, in subsequent seasons, we were able to excavate many more areas of the enclosure ditch. And it's quite clear now that the enclosure enlarged in the 7th century and then cut on numerous occasions. The expanded settlement is about 8,000 square meters, significantly larger than on a hill area, hill in its own right, and of course space is limited. And it's larger than enclosed hut groups described in Llangorse. The rampart itself, right, here we go, sorry, I'm out of sequence, but this is one of the ditch sections. And you can see the position, ploughed out position of the rampart. And this is the early medieval 2 first phase expansion. and then the later early medieval 9th century recutting. The rampart itself had a consistent thickness of between 2 and 2.2 meters all the way around where it survived. And we were so fortunate to pick this up. As you can see, it has survived because it's just below a scarp here. And most of the ploughing has ridden over this length of wall. But to the north, it's been completely removed. Absolutely nothing. All the features are truncated. And the only survival, the only evidence that we have for many of the structures is when they've subsided into earlier features. And so agriculture and ploughing has ridden over the top. And in fact, on the left, you can see Building 6, the corner of an early medieval. That has suffered a little bit of collapse because it's collapsing into a deep midden deposit, which is falling off the scarp, you can see at the bottom. And we only have the corner of the building, nothing else, no post holes, no gullies, no features whatsoever, simply bare rock and plough soil. And it just illustrates some of the problems on a site of this nature. Just another view looking towards the extramural area where some of the deposits are still quite dark. And there are some earlier features coming through. On the right-hand side within that, a ditch running parallel to the enclosure, which is produced a contemporary. So we have internal gullies, which are probably helping to drain areas and define areas. Sometimes ploughing has started to disturb the rampart, but it survived at the top of the slide there. And we've been able to establish some of these ditch sequences as a consequence. Midden deposits preserving part of the sequence, the southern part of it. So this is another example of collapse and preservation. So this is the inside face in Trench N on the east side of the enclosure. It's collapsing into the ditch of the early medieval over enclosure of the early medieval 1 phase, phase 8. So the wall is phase 10. And again, only that inner face has survived. Nothing else. So in comparing the ramparts, we can certainly look further afield to possible influences. But we don't have to go far to find local walling of this nature. It's all earth-fast, sometimes clay-bonded. If you look at Castell, even Llysros here in the 13th century, the keep at Nevern, they're all using clay-bonded stone construction. This is quite similar. Cosmoston is very similar as well in many respects, although much later in date. So that tradition of this form of construction exists at a later period. But then you can look at late Roman defences at Caergybi for the importance of enclosure defences and structures at Pantyci and in Llygwy as well. I'm travellers to Ireland, and I've listed various wall thicknesses here. Will have seen the massive stone enclosure walls surrounding Cashholes and so on, mainly on the west coast, on the west side, reflecting the availability of stone for these. And all the stone used at Llanbedrgoch is local. The problem with a lot of the Irish sites is they're not really dated. Their constructions are not dated very clear. Again, that's something that perhaps future investigations will address. Courts, as we know, centred on the hall, and hearths have been long recognised as the topos of the literature of elite life in Odin. So I'd like to just reference the fact that poetry and literature present images of entertainment for us, blazing hearths, cauldrons, laughter, singing, sharing, the drinking horn, distribution of gifts with an open door. And there are counterpoints to that with a poignant lament, a Heleth for her dead brother Cynfal, and Fulham contrasts the usual character of the Rees, now desolate, dark, and quiet, lacking its fire, beds, candles, assembly, people. They give us an insight into the hearts and minds of some of the people who experience these sites, use them. But in many respects, again, one of the questions we've got to ask is, what is a hall? When do we use the term? And what did it look like? Now, apart from the elite rulers, how did subjects, dependents, and others live? I know Nancy, in her splendid book on early medieval Wales, has addressed some of them. We certainly need to understand the conditions and the buildings that they lived in and died in, as well as the lifestyles of the people, their routines and health. Those are areas that Nancy has looked. Looking at the different styles of building, we do have evidence for one roundhouse, which you can, if you look beyond the immediate buildings on this slide, you can see a gully coming out from the right-hand section. And that lay beneath early medieval phase 12 building 1, which was 10th century. Interestingly, the radiocarbon date from the gully produced an EM2 date. It's possible that the carbon was an introduction into the fill of the gully. We can't be absolutely certain that there isn't an error there. Otherwise, we're looking at ground fast construction, the convention in terms of building practice on Anglesey at the period. And you see just along the section where my arrow is, that we've got evidence for ground fast posts for a substantial building on exactly the same spot as this later 10th century building. It was built in a very different building tradition or practice, using a sill beam wall of stones set in earth as well to support a timber superstructure. Here we have a plan of that curvilinear gully, or at least what survives of it. And none of the post holes can be reliably matched up to create an internal structure. It is a little bit of an enigma still. So I was going to put a coin of Cynfrith in, because of course she's the wife of Offa. So we're looking at the late 8th century. And this coin was found not just to the north of the enclosure, and is the earliest early medieval coin from the site. Also quite a rare coin in its own right. But it reminds us of some of the activity going on in North Wales at this time, certainly all the dyke building and everything else. There is a similar example from Dundalk, County Louth, or possibly part of the Ford. So we've been looking at the distribution. But otherwise, really, apart from Northumbrian stikers, that's all we have. The early medieval period. The sill wall method of construction, you can see the, I'll just outline the sill wall that's left is very narrow. So that would take an oak horizontal for timber superstructure. We've also found evidence for wattled impressions in fired clay daub. Some of this comes from early medieval contexts associated with buildings 2 and 3 here. Some of it comes from Neolithic contexts as well. But interestingly, so we could have the same method of infill within superstructures in all these periods. Interestingly, some of these fragments have lime wash on them, and one of them has a decorative moulding. But unfortunately, we can't be absolutely certain which periods we're dealing with. Are we looking at residual Neolithic material in this instance, or are we looking at early medieval infill within for some of these freestanding structures. The floors are characterized by being semi-sunken. They're only semi-sunken in the sense that they're cutting into the slope of the hill, provide a horizontal floor. Central hearths, and the clear area to the north is evidence for the location of benching, but we have no evidence really for the structure of any benching. You could create benching with horizontal beams just resting on the ground. What's interesting, though, is that the charcoal-rich trample area around the hearth helped define that ghosted shadow of benching, and also the prime area of cooking activity. And where they haven't used paving, they're using natural limestone, which they've flattened, they've quarried down to flatten as bedrock floor. The interesting thing about the zoological evidence studied by Meredith is that from her perspective, she can see the site involved in the production, consumption, and possible redistribution of animals. And so that suggests that we may be looking at an administrative state centre, at the very least, in the early medieval II period, from the 7th century onwards. The age and anatomical representation suggests a self-sufficient site with a mixed animal economy focused on cattle. And there are no striking differences in species representation and food economy between the pre-850 and the post-850 phases. There's continuity, there's no change in agricultural practice at all. So not only do we have a degree of continuity on the sites of some of the buildings, a continuity in livestock farming. And here again, just some other views of some of these wall-sill structures. Building 6 on the right of the slide with its collapsed corner. So that's all we have. What we can do is look at all the evidence from other parts of the site and start to recreate the buildings there in a strange way. And it's very clear that when this building was erected, they left a 1 meter gap between the inner face of the rampart. It's a form of passageway, if you like. And you can see that principle repeated around the site on those little stubs of walling that we're getting subsided into softer deposits. It reminds me of somehow of the radial plan of the much earlier migration period settlement in Sweden at Eketorp on Gotland, not on Öland, where you've got these long buildings radiating out, but they're actually built out from the inner face of the rampart. And on the left, you can see this rampart, corner of the building with the projection of its alignment. And then, which we'll come on to, the later burials from the early medieval phase 12 phase, taking us into the 10th century. The wall-sill building on the left, the large hall, if we're calling it a hall, large building. There's one of the radiocarbon dates, and the hearth from building 1 that we just looked at produced a very neat 10th century archaeomagnetic date for last firing. And there were some interesting fire clay sequences in the lines done by the Clark Laboratory of London. This is another illustration of the problem of interpretation, in that we've got a very dark earth hidden horizon, and on top of that you can see paving, and that paving is running over. You can make out a ditch very slightly running here. In fact, some of these the paving here was continuous with that originally. And it appears to be the floor of a long lost sort of 9th or 10th century structure, post-dating the midden deposits that it's sitting on. And again, that's all we have. We can look at comparable buildings. Building 1 is on the top left. They're not like the Dublin urban wattle-structured, round-cornered structures at all. And in fact, it looks very much, and they're very unlike Hedeby on the bottom from there. They've got benching. We've got a benched area around here. We've got benching either side. But there are features of all those structures and others we've looked at in detail, which are notably different from what's been here. The Midden Horizons were the most productive in terms of artifacts. And there you can just see some of them in Trench O, where we have an interesting distribution of artifacts, including a Roman coin of Helena down here somewhere above a ditch that Lodwick here is excavating. And these sequences were really important for us. So we just look at some of the dates there. I'm sorry, I haven't put the percentage probabilities on this. This was made up some time ago. And you can see the dark horizon, the base of it's running through there. The lower dates are coming from the transition to the Paleosol. Here you can see how this deposit is running off the limestone. Well planned. And here, that same limestone is outcropping, and but here you can see some of these gullies, which belong to the early medieval enlarged enclosure phase. And they include the construction of a formal pool to surround the natural spring that was the reason for the Neolithic, Mesolithic. Probably stayed open as a freshwater spring into the early medieval period. And this is a lined pool with early medieval 2, 7th, 9th century dates in the lower grey salts, and neatly a coin of Edmund, I think, mid-10th century, one of the upper grey salts. So that's staying in use until the 10th century. And the area to the right is still in use today for cattle. So that's an area that we've lost to cattle, I'm afraid. It's still providing fresh waters. Immediately to the left, you can see a little circle within this oval boundary. Now that's a bread oven. And again, this is another structure that seems to have longevity to it. The early dates are early medieval 2, phase 8, and the later radiocarbon dates from very often it's gorse that they're using to create fuel for the ovens and the hearths, is 10th century, 9th, 10th century. And this is a drainage gully running from it. It's a drain beneath the oven, the bread oven, and running down through the wall here. The building itself has 2 phases: earth-fast post structure in timber first, replaced by a sill beam construction. We only have a few fragmentary sections of wall, so we don't know the shape of that latter building. It may have fitted within that enclosure, but it might just possibly have extended beyond it. And again, in this area, this was the area where you were looking at some of the paving over these earlier EM2 phase 8 gullies. Those post holes are probably associated with an earlier earth-fast timber structure from that early enlarged phase. And then you've got the suggestion of some boundaries as well. The pool had this nice little feature, which little human touch, some little steps to allow you to step down with your bucket every morning and take water up to the buildings at the top of the slope, which I thought was quite nice. And you see this is bedrock here. It also raises the question, because that pool is quite wide, it's about 4 meters by 4 meters, you could actually bathe in it. And although we haven't put this in the report, you could even baptize someone. So But of course, there's no solid evidence of any such activity. But these are all, possibles that certainly we've considered. So again, we're now moving into the early medieval III period, and position of our enclosure with the natural freshwater spring eventually draining down in this stream down to Redwall. So you've got access from this point. Most of the modern moorings are here. In fact, it's still a very safe anchorage if the wind is in the right direction. The prevailing winds are from the southwest, so you're on the opposite side of the island. You can see why this was an attractive location. The short walk down in this direction, the short walk down in both areas. The top coins are the Carolingian hoard, Lewis the Pious, deniers of Lewis the Pious, a denier Pepin II, and deniers of Charles the Bold. But there is one penny of Archbishop Wilfrid of Canterbury as well. So it's not a pure Carolingian hoard, but it's interesting in that it's very similar to a hoard from Mullacloden in County Kildare and the Minchin Hole coin, Minchin Hole Cave on Gower. And this deposition in the 850s coincides with the decade in which we start to see Viking raids. I thought I'd show you the Red Wharf Bay hoards, which are on the other side of the bay, below Dinsilwy Hill Fort. The first recorded raid on Wales was noted in 850-852 when pagans slew Hungan. 3 years later, Anglesey was ravaged by the Black Host, which saw the defeat of Viking leader Horm or Ormur, chief of the Dark Foreigners. And what's interesting is that a lot of the some of the key Irish sources corroborate a lot of the raiding activity you see mentioned in Ocean. I put that in because that's an early 10th century pristine hoard, which may have been some form of diplomatic exchange gift, and certainly hasn't been used as hack silver. But the evidence for an economy which is enhanced in the early 10th century by much broader trading relationships across the sea is the range of lead weights. So here you see them. Some of them are capped. This one's capped with a pseudo-penannular roach terminal. This has got a nice bit of what was enameled metalwork. And then you see they reduce in size and shape. Some of them, I think these are weights, but there's nothing stopping you, in fact, using any of these as gaming counters as well. If you want to play a game, you pick up something to play with and use it. But unlike the Old Walk and the Viking army camp gaming pieces, they tend to be conical but hollow. And when you look at the weight distributions, we are looking at some of them corresponding roughly with what Pat Wallace called the Dublin ounce, around 26.6 grams. So we seem to have evidence there for a certain form of trade stamp with all its variabilities within that, although it's much harder to do anything with the smaller weights. And when you look at the hack silver has been cut up into very small parts. So we're looking at possibly small-scale transactions and not necessarily large-scale, expensive purchases. The Thor's hammer here is interesting. There's just a couple of parallel here because it brings us a little insight into faith. But this is a Thor's hammer that was found within the enclosure, decorated on dental decoration, but decorated heavily on one side. But it's been intentionally cut. So in fact, it's lost any apotropaic powers and is being used as bullion. But these are occasionally found in hoards, and it's still not certain in Scandinavian examples, where some of them may be actually protecting the hoards. But we also have lead crosses. These are paralleled at Mells on the Wirral. These are two from within the enclosure, very simply made in one-piece mold. So they are linking us to Christian faith within the settlement. And that symbolism is evident on some of the other objects, and finger rings, buckle plates, and so on. I thought I'd include some colour, because it's just nice to look at. This is the range of glass beads from within the enclosure. You know, they are an important example of what was reaching the site. The object in the bottom right is, I think, the end of a necklace, where you can imagine that the socket had some sort of chain, Trichinopoly chain possibly fastened inside it, and a loop on the top with a hook on the. I'm just going to run through some of the objects. Ring pins are often taken as important indicators of Norse activity. These are range of ring pins, not just from Llanbedrgoch, but the range that we're getting from Welsh sites. The polyhedral ones were plotted and well studied in Canning's monograph. Right? So we do have polyhedral ring pins from the site. The bells are interesting as well, because you've got these polygonal sided bells found in Iceland, but also some square bells, which are, if you like, they're miniature bells. They're almost replicating handbells of the type that we find in Ireland, in Wales as well, wrought iron. So that is the distribution of bells as we see them at the moment. But these are primarily, see from the colour, hexagonal plain ones associated with Scandinavian, Anglo-Scandinavians, whatever's going on around the Irish Sea. Excavations have allowed us to produce a typology of knife blades. And so following Ottaway's work in York, it can be difficult using someone else's typology, but a simple one. So these are the angle-backed Ottaway type A knife blades. And they range from quite large examples, which you could see as being used as weapons on occasions. This is the tang, and it's a decorated bit of the junction with the blade. There's a typology of quernstones as well, which is quite significant. They're all rotary quernstones with minor variations. One in situ in the upper fill of the ditch. Have to be an early medieval 3 upper fill. An indication of the status of the site is provided on the left by the whetstone there, which has parallels, which are slightly different from Ireland, but with elaborate decorated ferrules at the end, a suspension from a person's belt. But here you've got a helmet, viewable on all 4 sides, and it's a reminder of the warrior elite, owner possibly of the site, and a nice parallel on the right here from Rhythm, which has lost its similar ferrule, but it would have had one. Turning to the burials, there isn't much time to go into a lot of detail here, but we have quite a few burials from the site. Some of them, one of them internally, is formally buried within the enclosure. It's earlier, it belongs to the early medieval II phase. So we're looking at a settlement with burial within the settlement. And so we discuss that in the forthcoming publication. But here we see this cluster of non-normative burials, the upper fills outside the ramp, with some of the radiocarbon dates. The latest burial is this one here. You can just make out a slight cut for it into So this is John's looking at the calibrated dates. So burial 5, we've got a date range for that burial top. The middle one is looking at the combined results of radiocarbon dates on burial 4, part of the double burial we found. And then we've got on the bottom the combined date range for all the burials, which are placing it quite firmly in the 10th, all of them in the 10th century, apart from possibly this. Now, they appear to be, apart from the double burial here, which is a single event, we can see these as individual burials. What is, again, interesting is that they're lying on top of collapsed rampart. You can just see some poking up there. And the rubble from the rampart has then fallen on top of the burials as well. You really leave no surface feature unless they were marked in some way that we haven't. The date ranges are quite wide, from one child, an adolescent, and some adults. Burial 5 is the oldest adult male, 25. And the interesting thing about the double burial was that the upper male, adult male, lying on an young adolescent, seems to have had his wrist tight. And there was a slight cut to the rear of the skull. So that's that burial, the sequence within that particular. Because of the way in which research proceeds, our initial conclusions were wrong. So this is what we initially concluded, based on the work by people working on the facial reconstruction. We felt at the time that the skulls shared some genetic traits, but they all died in the 10th century. You can just read down that list. But of course, they weren't buried according to Christian practice. Although we did conclude that they might be the victims of raiding and possibly native to the island. But Katie Hamer's work on the isotopes has turned all that upside down. So we had to revisit everything. And as far as one can tell, we can see diverse sources, but none of them from Anglesey. None of them grew up on the island in there. The three faces here are in fact the same individual. It's amazing how you respond differently to the reconstructions and facial hair color and so on. And he is burial 3, the adult male lying over to young female. We thought it might be a male before, 9.5 to 14-year-old in that double burial. So he came from a different area. If they both came from different areas, there are question marks there to resolve. We'll run through some of the facial reconstruction evidence, taking pros. I think it's, at the end of the day, this excavation is all about people and trying to understand their lives and their significance to us today. So this is the last group photograph. I'm just going to show you some post-medieval activity. We have a late well house over the early medieval spring, 17th century. And that was a nice French 16th century chafing dish fragment from the rubble outside. I was going to talk a little bit about Glyn Farm, which is late medieval and has some very interesting 17th century phases. And that late well house over site 2, spring, is linked to the fortunes of the Bold family, who were stout royalists. And what do we find in the plasterwork put in the 1630s? But this clear reference to sort of campaign items and trophies, warfare, and so on. It makes you wonder why the building was never finished, because the Bolds were involved in the final surrender, second rebellion to Parliament. And that last phase of the farmhouse is there in foundation. It has an external fireplace. It was never built, and I think the money ran out. So with that view, and with help of Fimo modelling dough, this is a very quick attempt to give us an impression, a very slight impression of what it looked like. I think by the 10th century, we're looking at a fairly densely populated. And with that, I will finish. Very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's an absolutely fascinating site. I open up to questions and comments. I wonder whether I could start off just by, I was very struck by your building with the hearth at the centre and the sill walls. And what struck me about it when you put up the comparative plans is that you're making comparisons sort of westwards. The proportions for the building are exactly the same as we get in the early medieval traditions further east. And I wonder whether you've looked at that.
No, absolutely. Yeah. No, we've looked at every possible rectangular sill wall building you can find. And what is, as you say, what's interesting is the unit that is usually built is obviously ergonomically right for a family. And there's a consistency across sort of national borders. It just works. The Dublin ones tend to be smaller, but you're dealing with a very cramped space in an urban setting.
Yeah.
And the Dublin ones have entrances at both ends. Here we're looking at one-ended gable end entrances. A lot of the Anglo-Saxon ones have long wall entrances. So there are differences.
Yeah. It struck me that at one end where the stratigraphy changes, in an Anglo-Saxon, you would have a partition, a separated area, and I wondered whether that might.
We looked very hard. And yes, they may have had one.
Yeah.
Because the paved area takes the second half.
Yeah.
Close to the entrance. So you come in through the gable end. You have the paved area, wet clothing, and activities as well.
Yeah.
Of course, the doorway would have been an activity area in its own right for textile manufacture. I haven't gone into that, but a lot over into textile and so on. So you can see how the door would have been open a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And it would have been a very busy area, perhaps a quieter area, and there might have been a divide, which may only have been wattle.
Thank you. Questions and comments? Brilliant. Considering the revised
we talk about that quite a bit. And I think it's certainly quite likely that these are outsiders for whatever reason. Then there is an early medieval active cemetery just down the road, taking Christians and burying them and these people have been treated very differently and really been given short shrift. So they don't have the same status. What we can't do is ally their lives to their own historical. Their difference in age is interesting. We've got the fact that some of them may come from the border with England in the March area, Hereford, whatever. That could be the result of slaving. And we've got the Welsh annals referring additions to that. So I think you're absolutely right. It's just a shame that we're not, at the moment, going to get much further than suggesting it as a strong possibility.
Anushka will bring in any online questions. Any other?
that's an important question. And we kept asking ourselves, why is there so little evidence for marine diet? Because the isotope evidence has been done on the human remains, and it's a standard mixed diet with little marine content. We do have evidence for seafood being eaten. It's a lot of it is strand loping and picking up mussels, oysters, and that sort of thing. So they occur. So this is, this is take home on a Friday meal stuff. Not intensive activity, but it is an interesting question. It's very different from what's in the Hebrides. One thing, sorry, yeah, John.
Yes, I was struck by early mapping of Llanbedrgoch
I know.
in the bay, yes, which means the bay of the boathouse.
Yeah. There's an upper one and a lower one.
Yeah, yes, there's an upper and a lower one somewhere. Boathouse archaeology has been in Norway. Do you know anything about this history?
I invited David Parsons to reinvestigate some of the Scandinavian things. And at the same time, I quizzed him on, we don't think it goes back, but he has written a fairly substantial piece of work on place names, including the obvious one, Anglesey itself, and Presterholm, and so on. And I, rather than me reveal his thoughts, probably better to wait. We would dearly have liked to find, it would have been a simpler write-up if we had clear evidence for hanging with crushed vertebrae and whatever. The skulls and upper vertebrae were lifted, everything was excavated material, lifted on block and re-excavated in the lab. So I don't think we've missed any evidence for that sort of thing. The only evidence, which I don't think I showed a slide of, was a slight cut mark on the back of burial 3, this adult male, an unhealed cut, not a fatal cut, but it's evidence of violence. We don't know the cause of death for any of these individuals. But yes, I mean, with Andrew Reynolds' work on execution sites, obviously I've been looking at that as well, just to see whether any mileage in it. At the moment, the evidence isn't there.
Fascinating. In the reference. Clearly, these boats couldn't very long. From one relatively.
Yes.
Do you think that's how they move?
Well, it'll be a mixture of vessels of different sizes. There's a reference to Llanbedrgoch, Red Wharf Bay by fire, who describes it as a mean place for small boats or something. So small fishing boats are obviously in use there in that period. But you've only got to look at the Sea Stallion replica that sailed from Roskilde down to Dublin to know that significant sea voyages of length, if they were prepared well, and if you waited for the right weather condition, sea states, which is what a good sailor would do. So if you want to sail from Dublin, say, to Chester, you're going to wait until the wind direction's in the right direction. There's no risk. And if you want to have a night stopover, well, Red Wharf Bay is right there for you, and I'm sure that was going on in the early 10th century to some extent with that trading going on. But you get short hop things as well. So a lot of the later trade that we know about tended to be with Chester and so on. and they, not traveling long distance. Well, there are these various devices, methods of navigating during the period. So I don't think navigation was an issue. And the one thing you notice is that Scandinavian coastal names are really aid memoirs in terms of navigation. So if you want to tell someone how to get to Grassholm, you tell them you pass you pass Skerries and so on with Anglesey on Skerries on the north side of Anglesey. You can use a lot of Orm's Head, another one. So these are all navigational features that a sailor can tell the family, can tell his crew, can tell other crews about, and they can use these as navigational wayfinders. So there's a lot of that going on.
Very late. From what you
It depends what you mean by continue. I think, yeah,
we've
got it represented in all the periods. So it's a favoured spot, and that's its favourable condition.
My question why?
But it doesn't. I haven't had time to go into that, but there's some evidence for medieval activity. We've got medieval finds from the site to field area and coins. And we've got some evidence that the 10th century building had a later phase to it, which is possibly contemporary with burial 5, the 11th, 12th century burial. And there's a rectangular structure to the north of the field, which is probably medieval. It had a nice 12th century spur in the centre of it. But that hasn't been fully investigated. And what we do know that in the 12th century, the enclosure was transected by boundary ditches, cutting through the buildings. And so it looks as if by then the rampart, which would have, even in the 10th century, that rampart was about 300 years old. So it's not surprising that within the first phase ditch fills, we're getting tumble from the rampart. And that we're certainly getting it by the time those burials come in. So that rampart was probably nearing the end of its life by the 10th century, and it had been abandoned by the second half of the 10th. But the fertile, valuable land was then subdivided and reused for farming. And so what we think the settlement nearby, possibly the building to the north, is part of that new farming plan for the area.
Mark, you've done a fantastic piece of field work, an amazingly long sequence. Really good to see it coming together, and we're up to seeing the volume coming out. So can we thank Mark for a splendid lecture? I give notice that our next meeting at Burlington House next Thursday, we will hear a paper, Faith, Patriotism and Beauty, Henry Arundel's Transformation of Wardour Castle by Frederick Harvey Bathurst. Meeting stands adjourned. There's a reception upstairs.
In the committee room.
Thank you all for coming.